Now let's move our discussion to the subject of graphs and visuals and other types of charts that you might want to include in a formal report. Why would you use these types of visual aids? There are four general reasons why people use these types of visual aids. One is to clarify data. The other is to create visual interest. Graphs and charts just look a whole lot more interesting than a big blob of text. They capture people's attention. They can also condense and synthesize data and present a lot of data in a much smaller and much more manageable way. And they can make numerical data in particular more meaningful. If people were just left to the raw numbers, to lists of raw numbers, they may not be able to draw the connections. They may not be able to see the patterns. But once you put them in a graph, or you put them in a chart of some sort, or you put them in a visual, wow, it makes people really pay attention to that data. And it makes the data understandable. And that's what communication is all about, reaching understanding. So always think about whether or not you could be using some type of visual to convey the idea that you're trying to express with the words in your report. And when you are using visuals, you want to make an extra effort to make sure that you match the graph to the objective. Each type of graph or visual has a particular objective and works best under certain circumstances. A table is used generally to show exact figures and values. That's more data. It's less picture. Then you get to something like the bar graph. And a bar graph compares related ideas, related items. You go to the line chart, and the line chart will show you changes in quantitative data over time. And just so you know, all of these are explained at length in your textbook. There are pictures of the various types of graphs in the PowerPoint that you should be following along, and you can see, just so you know what these various types of graphs look like, so you know which ones will be most appropriate in your paper. A pie chart. A pie chart is used to visualize a whole unit and the proportion of its components. Many of these you will find potentially useful in your report as you're talking about and presenting information about your company. You can use a flow chart, which often is used to display a process or a procedure. Probably not much use of flowcharts in your papers, but they may be very useful if you are trying to explain a process, explain a report, or explain the results of a particular process. Organizational charts. They can be used to define any type of hierarchy or elements. You would want to use them to show maybe management levels. You might be wanting to show the various subdivisions and divisions in a larger corporation. But many of these types of representations will be appropriate for use in your paper. And remember, for your paper, you need to have at least 3 different types of graphics in your paper. At least 3. They could be the same type, but I would recommend, just to prove to me your facility with all the various types of graphs, if you could do one pie chart, one bar chart, one line chart, or one hierarchy chart, an organizational chart. Try to mix it up and try to give at least two, if not three, different types of charts, visuals in your report. Also, you could use maps, you could use pictures, you could use photographs. Those are much less helpful in the type of report that you are preparing, but they may be helpful for a different type of report that you might need to prepare in the future. And now we're going to talk about probably what you are most interested in throughout the discussion of Chapter 10. What really needs to go into your paper? And you've already seen a sample of an APA style paper. I've posted it in the content section of the Blackboard site. It's available through cengagebrain.com, but I want you to take a look at it because it shows you the component parts of a formal report, most of which you will need to include in one way or another in your formal report, the report you're preparing for me. So there's a title and the cover page. You don't have to worry about binding these reports. You're going to be submitting them to me electronically. And this is one of the areas where your textbook might still be a little bit archaic, because many formal reports now are not delivered in a hard copy form, but rather are delivered in electronic form. It's easier to share them. It's easier for them to be distributed throughout an organization. It's easier to just get them to people. It's much easier to deliver an electronic form of a report than to deliver a hard copy form of a report. So don't worry so much, and you don't have to worry at all, because you're going to be submitting your reports to me electronically. So I don't care about the professional binder or the cover, and more business is moving away from these hard copy types of reports and presentations, especially as people become more concerned about the environment and the massive use of paper in business. You want to see the textbook example and the example just to get an idea about how the title page should be organized, what should be on it, where they should be on the page. I don't want to take the time to talk about that right now. If anybody has any questions, please let me know. But I think you can understand how to do it by looking at the examples that are given in your textbook, in the sample that I posted, in the Cengage material that's available to you. Your book talks a lot about a letter or memo of transmittal. You normally would be doing that, especially if you were delivering the report either to someone outside your organization, or if you were going to be delivering it to someone, a manager, someone who might be a little bit higher up on you in the organizational chart. You wouldn't necessarily do a letter to someone internally, but you might do a memo. You might explain why, who asked you to do this report, what the report is all about, what's the principal conclusion, and then attach your report to that memo, or enclose your report. If you're sending it to somebody outside your organization, you could incorporate. You could enclose it with a letter of transmittal that includes the information that's described in your textbook, and that sort of explains a little bit about what the report is, what your findings are, why you went about doing this report. Your table of contents. your table of contents will list your various headings. It's going to be up to you to decide how many levels of headings to have in your report, and then how many of those levels get included into your table of contents. I personally suggest you not, for this paper, a 10-page paper, which is really going to have about 6.5 pages of text. I would suggest that you not do too many layers of headings. I would say no more than 2 layers, and you may be perfectly adequate with just 1 layer of headings. You would list your headings in the table of contents, and you would then list the page where that heading appears and where that portion of the report begins. You would also do a table of illustrations or a list of illustrations, and you would list there. You would not set forth the individual items, but you would set forth at what page you would find figure 1, which describes stock price, or figure 2, which describes historic revenues, and figure 3, which describes sub-organizations within the subsidiaries and sub-organizations in the corporation. So you would just identify which graphic is located on what page. And in your report, most likely the table of contents and the table of illustrations can be on the same page. If your table of contents and table of illustrations are both short enough, no matter what the type of the report, you can always put them on the same page. If your paper is long and you have a multi-page table of contents, you still can put the table of illustrations at the end of the table of contents. It may be that it sits on the same page with the last portion of the table of contents. After the table of contents, now you're actually in the report itself. And the first thing you're going to put in the report itself is the executive summary. For your paper, the executive summary can be 3-4 sentences, possibly with some bullet points where you detail the principal areas that you looked at, or the principal pieces of data that make up your ultimate and final report. Your executive summary could be significantly longer if your report is longer. If your report's 200 pages, your executive summary might be three or 4 pages, and it might have headings, and it might have some breakdowns, and it might even have a list of the various headings to direct people even into the various subparts of the executive summary. The executive summary is intended to be strategic. You want to enable a manager, someone who is looking at this, who may not have time to read the whole report, to be able to read the summary and know, in long or short, what the ultimate conclusion is. Then after your executive summary, you have an introduction. For your paper, a paragraph. You want to just maybe 2, but I would say you probably can get by with a 1-paragraph introduction. You describe what led to the report being written. You describe the process. You mention the scope of your report. You might identify who commissioned the report. You don't necessarily need to do that in our report because we all know who commissioned the report. But if your report is one that may be going to multiple sources outside of your organization, you might need to identify who commissioned the report so people know where the report came from. You can explain a little bit about your sources. Then you get into the meat of the report, the actual formal components of the report. You want to deal with the body. You will be presenting and analyzing data in the body of your report. You're going to want to break it into logical segments and use headings to flag when you're changing from one segment to another. Your heading should be clear and descriptive so that your receiver, your reader, knows what will follow in the section after that heading. You're presenting your research. You're explaining all the data that you've gathered. You're going to identify a potential solution to the problem that you have been studying. And then you're going to conclude your report with your conclusions and with your recommendations. In your report, your recommendation is going to be whether or not this hedge fund should invest in the company that you've profiled, that you've studied, or if they are to invest, should they invest a large amount, a small amount? Should they stage their investment to see how certain things develop with the company? I mean, your recommendation is going to depend on the data you find. But you definitely want to have conclusions and recommendations in your paper. Conclusions and recommendations can probably be lumped together into one section. Again, it should be maybe a paragraph, maybe 4 or 5 sentences. If your conclusions and recommendations are rather lengthy, then you may need to put those into separate sections, but they would be at the end of your report. Then you would have your closing, and that would basically be the wrap-up of your report. You could then include what is sometimes called back matter in your report. That would be appendices of additional data that was too voluminous, or maybe there were it's figures and charts that were too big to include in your text. But if you refer to them in your text, then you can attach them to your report as appendices. And if there's one appendix, you can just label it appendix. If there are more than one appendices, then each one should be Appendix A, Appendix B, Appendix C, or Appendix 1, Appendix 2, Appendix 3. And they need to be, if you are putting appendices in your report, they need to be identified in the text of the report so people understand where to go look for this data, and also when they are going through your report, they understand what this data is. You then have to have your list of references or your works cited. We're doing APA format, so our references will be in APA format. If you were doing MLA, you would label this page works cited. It would not be labeled as references. And again, if you're using a different style, you would identify, maybe use the term bibliography, whatever the appropriate term is and the style that you're using. But I would suggest business has moved toward one or the other of these styles. Certain of the natural sciences might use a different style, and even more abbreviated style. But I would say stay with APA or MLA. Most business, professional, academic sources and operations now use one or the other of APA or MLA. And then as you're putting your report together, your textbook gives you a laundry list of tips that you should follow. They're included in the PowerPoint slides as well. Many of them are common sense. Take your time. Finish collecting your data before you start to write. Just remember, That's the way that we've talked about communicating all semester long. You gather your data, then you write, then you put it into your first draft, and then you revise your first draft. Try to do a good outline. Work from a good outline. Use all the features of your computer. Don't don't try to rush it all at the last minute. Always leave yourself enough time. When you're writing, write rapidly. Get your ideas down. Don't edit yourself while you're writing. Editing and revision will follow later. Get the ideas out. Let the ideas flow before you lose the idea. It's much better to get the idea down in a disorganized format now and go back and add the organization and reorganize than to lose an important train of thought because you went back and tried to self-edit. Try to be consistent and parallel in your usage. Use verbs consistently. Make sure that you always use proper mechanics. Let your first draft sit. Remember, I told you this at the beginning of the semester. Your book talks about this. You always need to leave some time after you finish your first draft. Don't immediately rush into the revision and proofreading stage. Give it some time. Let it sit. Wait a day if you can. Then go back to it and then work on it. And remember the third phase, revision and then proofreading. Revise for clarity. Revise for coherence. Revise for making your work comprehensible. And then proofread. Proofread for typos. Proofread for grammar and usage. Proofread for spelling. Proofread 3 times at least before you turn in your paper. And if you have the opportunity, have someone else proofread it for you. We can talk more about these in our class on Chapter 10. I'm always available if you have additional questions. This is a critical phase where we're in the final stretch. We're working on your papers. I want you to be able to present the best possible paper you can. So please use all the resources that are available to you to get the best product. Take care, and I'll see you in class for Chapter 10.